Mark and I are back again today to talk about the psychedelic conversation. Hello, Mark.
Hello.
And I think last time when we left off, we were at about minute 25 and a half, something like that. So I thought we could pick it up from there. They're still talking about what happens during the process of dialogos when people are, I think he's talking about the circling process. John is talking about the circling process.
Circling and philosophical fellowship, and like
right
as the practices. He listed a few,
yeah.
But I think there are probably more, right?
So I thought maybe we could just play a couple of minutes of the video and then take it from there.
Sure.
So I'm going to try to share screen. My share screen has been a little wonky lately, so it may or may not work. So let's see what happens. Apparently it's not going to work.
No, it doesn't like you when it's recording, apparently. It tested it before.
When we weren't recording, it was working fine, right? Maybe we'll just try one more time. Maybe it just needs once to kind of warm itself up.
That could be.
Well, we can tell who's on here anyway. I am not a happy camper ever since my my Mac OS upgraded itself.
Oh my goodness.
I'm gonna have to call them up and find out what's going on. Well, so okay, I did do a transcript because I was worried that this kind of thing might happen. And so at this point, John says, so what people start to do in relationship to the way the logos is unfolding, they start to see a pattern of how things can unfold and make sense. And then they start to see that that is the way reality makes itself known to them. I thought that was very interesting because right. I've been playing with this idea for quite a while about how reality makes itself known to us. And then for him to pop that in there, I thought, wow, that's pretty cool. So then Jordan says, and Jordan is making these leaps that are they just seem to come from out of left field. But so you have to really think your way through to where did he get that leap? So Jordan says, so is that why you are so interested in consciousness? We find it difficult to distinguish between the consciousness of reality and reality itself. Now, I thought that was an interesting move on his part. What do you think he was getting at between those two, the consciousness of reality and reality itself?
Yeah, well, actually, there's something really interesting here because what actually happens is John makes the claim that right after he says ultimate pattern of reality discloses, right? He says that's how they start to think. And I'm not quite sure, like in the moment or overall. And I thought that was a whopping sort of a claim. But I can see why he said it. And in my notes, I have, referee will allow, right? I was like, it's like, see where he's going, right? Which is interesting because John's going in one direction. And to your point, Jordan's going in a completely different direction. And it's another one of these things that's hard to understand about the conversation when you don't have the larger context of where Jordan's going in general, right?
Right. Well, so let's go back to what John said. Then he said, that's how they start to think. You mean the participants in the circling process?
Or in general, I don't know. Yeah, probably the participants in the circling process, right? He's saying they start to think, right? So you start to think as though reality is disclosing itself to you, ultimate reality or something, right? The ultimate, I think the term he uses is the pattern that ultimately discloses reality to them, which is not the same as disclosing the pattern of ultimate reality. It's like very tricky. And John's pretty careful with his words. So I think he's real careful with his words, probably more careful with his words than Peterson is. But yeah, and then to your point, it's like, okay, but then Peterson, and my note here is, Peterson knows that John's interested in consciousness. Peterson's not not familiar with John's work. He knows John's work. He knows John's work pretty well, right? And that's where it gets back to this consciousness question again. And you know, he's on the level there, right? Like we're trying to find a distinction between the consciousness of reality and reality itself, right? Which is something like our phenomenological experience of reality and quote objective material reality or something.
Well, I was kind of wondering that, and I might be way off base on this, but I've been trying to up my game on philosophy. So so I was listening to the video that Paul had recommended the other day. This is probably the third or fourth time I've listened to this video, but Paul had recommended it and it reminded me about this guy that does the half-hour philosophy lesson.
Yeah.
You ever heard that one? Where he goes through
it once. I wanted to listen to it again, but I couldn't.
He goes through all of philosophy in 30 minutes. And so I was taking notes. So I only got through about the first 10 minutes of it. But that was enough for him to be talking about the difference between Plato and Aristotle. And it almost sounds here as though that the distinguishing between the consciousness of reality and reality itself is maybe the difference between Plato and Aristotle.
Yeah.
Is that possible? Because I get the feeling that Jordan is very aware that John is a Plato guy, and maybe Jordan is more of an Aristotle guy.
Yeah, I think Aristotle, you know, birthed science, roughly speaking, right? Or right, that's where it all kind of started, was this, right? Whereas Plato is very much, so one of the concepts that's in the Neoplatonic realm there is this, that I think was Plato's original idea was, you know, there's the forms, right? Which, I like eidos better, right? And then we have contact with that either before birth or at birth or something weird. And that's how we know beauty. Like, really, Plato? That's your explanation? It's like, well, we were there before, so we recognize it when we see it. Okay, maybe it's a little weird, but maybe. And then, yeah, I think there is a difference in kind between that and, you know, but I mean, philosophy often seems to go back and forth with, is phenomenology the thing, or is there something non-phenomenological?
Well, the way this philosophy guy described the difference between Plato and Aristotle is, first of all, he said Aristotle argued that forms don't exist in some ethereal reality, but in the things themselves. The meta world isn't just up there,
right,
but down here. And Plato, he uses an example. Plato, you could say one of your ideas, one of your eidos is human being. Then human being is a form to which humans should conform themselves. Mm-hmm. But Aristotle's idea is that human being is a substance that contains both form and matter, which dictates proper action in order to fulfill its maximum potential. Now that sounded like a JBP move to me.
Yes.
Both form and matter, which dictates proper action in order to fulfill its maximum potential.
Yeah, I don't think there's so much of a conflict right there, mm-hmm. right?
Well, ultimately, I don't think it is a conflict, because the early Christian move was to adopt some of the Platonic language. And then I guess when Aquinas came along, he folded in the Aristotelian language to kind of fill things out. So there's a combination, like in all these things, there are these seemingly polar issues that actually fold together into one thing. And so the Platonic and Aristotelian apparently have a meeting of the mind somewhere.
Right. Well, I don't see a conflict there at all. I mean, it really depends on what Aristotle said. He said, no, they're not in the ethereal realm, because actually what you read, it sounded like they're in both realms. Well, mm-hmm. that's different. Like that's mm-hmm. totally different if that's true, right? Mm-hmm. Because then there's no conflict. Mm-hmm. He's just adding something. He's not saying that doesn't exist. He's mm-hmm. adding something to it. Right. And so, yeah, I mean, it makes sense. There has to be an element of the eidos in order for us mm-hmm. to conform to the eidos in the material realm. I don't have an opinion on that one way or the other. I don't think it matters. I think they're chasing the wrong dog or something to some extent. But yeah, I think that's correct, is that Peterson's more Aristotelian because he's oddly, in some sense, more scientific than John in this particular instance anyway. Right, and John's very much more mystical than Peterson is in general, in my opinion. So yeah,
but it's so funny because they seem to flip the other way in terms of their process.
Yes.
Because
exactly.
John's process is very step by step, build on. And Jordan's process is
right. Well, I think interesting.
Grab an idea out of the stratosphere.
Right. But I think Jordan and I have a lot in common. Like, yeah, this science stuff is great, but it's way too constraining. And there's other ways to do it that can get you there faster. Because I'm very much a get there faster kind of person. So it's like, yeah, let's get there faster. This bothersome science validation nonsense is it's just too complicated and too slow. We need to get to bigger answers quicker. We can't do this step-by-step sort of dictates that science restrains us to. So yeah, I agree with all of that. I think that's correct. But I mean, again, philosophy goes back and forth with this. Is the primal thing objective material reality, right? Which I think your nice talk that I watched the other day with the physicist sort of puts that to bed, that no, doesn't exist.
Well, I mean,
right? Or is the primal thing, our phenomenological experience, right? And so I'm not saying either doesn't exist, we'll say, but which is the primal thing? And if the primal thing is the, this objective material reality, that changes everything. And the scientists, I think, want that because they're going to appeal to that because that's their domain. Like, we know what objective material reality is. That is their I agree, that's their domain. I just don't think it's primal. I think it's subject to something else, right? And the thing it's subject to is an observation, not an observer, an observation, which would be something like the manifestation of something in a particular instance of time, we'll say. And so that gets around the problem that you were talking about with your physicist friend about, observer. Like, I don't care about observer. I care about, does it come in contact with something that causes a manifestation, right? Because that's an observation. It's a totally different thing. Now we've changed the game again, right? Oh, because then it gets back to your original question. Well, somebody had to build the thing that makes the observation, right? So we're back to subjective and objective have a relationship to one another, right? And I think that is right, because now what we're really doing though is we're scientifically just getting half steps towards Hume's guillotine. And so I don't think we're ever going to get there still. I don't care if you're John or George. What? Hume's guillotine, the is-ought dilemma.
Oh, okay.
That's Hume's guillotine. Yeah, if you want to look it up on Wikipedia, Hume's guillotine. Well, except that spelling guillotine is impossible because it's a French word, like my last name. Terrible French people, and they're horrible spelling of actual words. So yeah, I think you're just getting closer to that, right? You're just kind of slicing that as much as you can, but you're only taking half steps. You're never going to get there. So right, that's Zeno's paradox, if my memory is correct. So yeah, I don't know how fruitful that line is. Like, I think there's just a difference, and you have to kind of suck it up and realize there's a gap there. And
well, so then John goes on and he says, that's why I've coined the term transjective to try and talk about these relationships of participation. They are being co-created. Now, when he says they are being co-created, what's the reference to? Who is he, when he says they, who does he mean? They are being co-created.
Oh no, the experiences, right?
The experiences are being co-created.
Yeah, these kinds of experiences are the
okay.
They. So the experience of, so I guess it's, hopefully this is fair to John, but I think it is. The experience of coming into contact with the thing that's disclosing the ultimate pattern to you, the pattern of reality, is the thing you're co-creating in some sense.
Ooh, that's what he really thinks, huh?
I don't think he thinks that. I think that's what he's saying, which are two different things, because I get the experience from John that he's on one side or the other of his ought at any given time, and he doesn't necessarily call that out. Whether or not he knows, I don't know what he knows, but yeah, I very much get that feeling. But they all are. I mean, everybody trying to play this game is on one side or the other.
The logos is a co-creation of human minds.
It could be. I don't want
I
to
mean,
say
no. I mean, in terms of what you just said, John is saying, it sounds like
there's an implication that if the logos is the thing that discloses ultimate reality or something, then that would be true.
Okay.
But I'm not even sure anybody would make that statement, because that seems a little...
Well, they're afraid to make, I mean, people don't make the statement, but the implications are just flying all around that. So
I agree. Right. I agree. They're still flip-flopping, right? Like you saw.
I mean, isn't that also, you know, I thought, you know, I know Jordan is a Jungian, but
right.
John never claims to be a Jungian, but isn't that Jung's idea that this is all just a manifestation of minds, collective consciousness?
That's my understanding. Yeah. Jung's clearly on the on the fuzzy side, right?
Yeah.
On the mystical side, whereas these other people are on the science side, and that was one of the great things that Paul van der Klee did in his dissection of the Krauss-Peterson talk, right? Where he said, look, fuzzy word, because Krauss just kept using fuzzy words. It's like, dude, you can't say science, oh, fuzzy word, science. Like, no, you've got to bridge that somehow. And he doesn't. He just throws out these effectively meaningless words because they're decontextualized, right? That some words require a lot of context. I've actually been looking for a name for this for a while because I want to do a video on it. Some words require a lot of context, like a lot of context. You can't just throw them out even in a sentence. They need a lot of scaffolding to have any sort of meaning whatsoever, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, like a word like love, like just to know what kind of love you're talking about,
mm-hmm.
a lot of context is required.
Yes. Well, so John goes on to say that the notion, the transjective notion, is ultimately derived from Tillich's idea of the symbol as that which grounds, which makes possible the relationship between the subjective and the objective. It would be the idea that you have in ancient epistemology, not knowledge representing something over there, but Aristotle would say that the mind and the object that is known come into conformity. Shape as a metaphor for form, Platonic form. That which makes it be what it is that which makes it knowable for what it is. I come into conformity with the cup. Now, that statement, that which makes it be what it is that which makes it knowable for what it is. He lost me there. That's a little bit, you know, I got lost there. Does that make any sense to you? That which makes it be what it is that which makes it knowable for what it is?
Yeah. So John's very big into conformity. So my notes here, I said, you know, John invokes his conformity argument with objects, right? So knowledge as conformity, right? In other words, and this is kind of interesting, that implies that propositional knowledge isn't knowledge to some extent, right? It's not the same type of knowledge as conforming to something. It's participatory knowledge, which actually John says these two types of knowledge are different. And I totally agree with that. I think that's right. And then he uses shape as a metaphor for form, right? And again, I like IDOS better than form. And then structural functional organization. And they agree on Piaget, which is nice. And Peterson claims that you're mimicking the cup by understanding it. And Vervaeke says you shape yourself to it, right? And I'm not sure why that's different, but John seems to think those two things are different. And I'm like,
well, he says it's the difference between Cartesian and theological, which I thought was a really interesting comment.
Right.
So the Cartesian would be the more scientific view, right? And the theological would be the more transformational view.
Exactly. And this is another place where he crosses things again, I think, right? So I have a whopping statement about the Cartesian way of understanding is fundamentally narcissistic one, right? Just understand the propositions and all as well, right? That's the Cartesian way of doing these things, right? Whereas the theological approach is one around transformation to understand, right? And you know, if you don't do that, you lose access to the deep truths, right? And that's the conformity theory of knowing instead of the representational theory of knowing.
Yeah, that one sent me off into a long trail of thinking about doing artwork. And I'm sure you've seen paintings of landscapes that seemed more real than the landscape that you actually saw when you were there.
Right.
Right? Because you can, when you were there, you could feel the light, you could see the light, but when you see it in the painting, it transforms you somehow to see the light through that artist's eyes. So that there's more of this, the artist was conforming themselves to that landscape in order to represent whatever that conforming transformed in them onto the canvas, which is quite different than somebody who just painstakingly paints the landscape so that it looks exactly like the photograph, because that just kills it, right?
Yeah.
It just kills whatever was there. And
right. So that theory is something like they're encoding their transformation onto the canvas, not the thing they see.
Yeah.
Right? Or not just the thing they see or something. Yeah.
Right. Rather than encoding the pixels onto the canvas.
Right.
Which would be, the Cartesian.
Right.
Right.
Right. No, I think that's probably correct. Right. So there's a way in which you can do that, which you can take your transformation, put that information in the canvas, and it gets conveyed to other people if they're receptive. And that gives them an additional perspective about the landscape, even if they've seen that landscape themselves. I think that's totally fair.
Yeah. And then John says, people feel themselves being conformed to reality through the logos.
Right.
Which I thought that was, I put it in bold and in red.
Yeah.
But Jordan makes this huge leap after that then. So he says, so that's a feeling of personal transformation. Is that same feeling of tracking?
Well, but interestingly in my notes, he's silent, trying to.
Oh yeah. I have pause written in there. He's
right. Well, I think he's looking up and doing this too, right? I think he's like, doing the thing, right? He's doing all of his little things, right? And he's really thinking about this. And he's not usually silent for this long, right? His speed went from 90 miles per hour to 0 really fast, unexpected. I mean, this is unexpected behavior out of Peterson, especially given the tenor and tone of the conversation up to this point, because he's only had one other stopping point. Didn't last quite as long as this one. And unless you really understood what happened, you wouldn't get it. Like, they're running at these ideas at a very high rate of speed, and they're trying to get sort of race to the bottom of what they're on about. And then they reach a bottom, right? Or at least Peterson does fairly quickly. And yeah, I mean, this is unlike most of the conversations you've ever seen, because who does that? Like, other than Peterson and a handful of other people who digs this deep, but almost nobody can go as fast as Peterson. Like, there's few people, right, who are even that quick. I mean, there's a couple, but there's not a lot. And, you don't see them every day. So, and he's super excited again to get somebody who can go there with him, like at the speed at which he operates. So that's that's a feeling of personal transformation. And JB interrupts again, by the way, and says it's a feeling of, right? Is that the feeling of tracking, right? And Vervaeke agrees. And then Peterson goes off. Like, from my perspective, this goes off into this stumbling uphill with the cross thing towards the city, and then John tries to correct him by interrupting again. Right?
Well, hold on. Let's go back to that thing, because I was trying to think that through when he said, "Is that same feeling of tracking?"
Yeah.
When you think of like the Native American trackers or people like that are really good at tracking, they put themselves into whatever it is that they're tracking, right? So it is a conformity theory of knowledge. Yes. They become what they're tracking. And I think that's what he's saying, right?
And John agrees to all of that. John agrees to that part.
Yeah. But I think Jordan is thinking of that. And at the same time, he's also thinking of that he's on the track of something. I can't remember if it's before this or after this that he starts talking about tracking the beast.
That's after this.
That's after this. Okay. But he is on the track of something. And if he's simultaneously on the track of something and trying to explain this idea of tracking, then he's putting himself into what it is that he's tracking.
Oh, yeah.
Putting himself into that is he's stumbling uphill toward the city of God because, okay, because this thing he's on the track of is the Logos, and the Logos is carrying the cross up to the top of the hill.
Yeah, towards the city of the hill, and that's where John corrects.
Right. But the problem is, and I think you mentioned this before, and Paul has mentioned this before, that in Jordan's conversation with Rebel Wisdom early on, he talked about this stumbling up the hill toward the city of God. And the guy said, "What's up there?" And Jordan said, "That's where you discover that yours is the ultimate responsibility for everything." Right.
That's the mistake.
So that's this burden, this unbelievable burden that you're carrying by yourself, stumbling up the hill toward the city of God. And I don't understand. On the one hand, he takes the Bible very seriously. And on the other hand, he leaves out this whole thing about the burden, because when Christ talks about the burden, he says, "Take up my yoke. My yoke is easy and my burden is light." And the yoke is this, like a yoke for animals. You put it on two animals and they go together. And of course, if Christ is the one and I'm the other one, then he's carrying the most of the weight and I just get the easy side, basically. But I mean, it's a matter of going together. And the interesting thing is that word burden in that verse is the same. There's this strange passage in Galatians chapter 6, where it says, "Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ." And then later on in the same chapter, it says, "Each one must bear his own burden."
Right.
Well, what? Well, there are two different Greek words. The first one, "bear one another's burdens," is a word for like a heavy, heavy weight. The same word for weight that's used in the verse where it talks about the weight of glory that is coming after our long, long struggles. Heavy weight. So we're to bear, when another one has this heavy weight, we're to bear one another's burdens and help them. But the second one, "Each one must bear his own burden," that's a specialized burden. That's a burden that's specialized to each person. It's like your own pack. It's your pack that has the things in it that you need to carry for yourself. And so kind of the way I see that is that we each do, you and I have talked about this issue of the anomaly being a gift or the anomaly being a miracle.
Right.
In a sense, that specialized burden is that anomaly that's fitted to me.
Right.
My specific burden that I'm supposed to carry, that's going to transform me and that's going to change me and that's going to help me on the path, and the struggles that I have to overcome in order to become who I am going to become. Right. That's that specialized burden. So I think Jordan needs to take that burden apart into two parts. Look at both parts of the burden and not just think of that one burden that he's dragging up the hill toward the city of God, where in one sense, we are all responsible for everything, right? There is a sense in which that's true. And Michael and I have had a couple of conversations about that. But there's another sense in which, if you look at the picture of the body of Christ, each of us is only one member of the body of Christ. Some are an eye, some are a toe, some are an elbow. And as such, we each have our own part of the burden to carry, but not the whole thing. We carry it together as the body.
Right.
That's how we support one another in the body.
There was some critique I was watching of this particular thing. I don't know if it was Pastor Paul, or I probably was. And the point was made that the problem with Jordan's conception is just that, like, you know, in order for you to do it alone, you have to do it on the backs of everybody else. But that's not what that's outside of Christian doctrine, right? We're all supposed to get there together, and so it can't be that, right? It can't be. And I think that's. I mean, it's, you know, I don't know that much about any of this stuff. I think we're into theology. I don't know, but that makes sense to me. Like that fits with my limited understanding of how this all works. Is that, yeah, there's no one's supposed to be up there alone. Like, no, because then they'd have to do so at the expense of everybody else to some degree, because they'd be at the bottom, right? The people at the bottom, they're not all there, right? You all need to be at the top of the hill, so together. So yeah, I take that critique pretty seriously. Yeah, it doesn't sound like Jordan's, you know, talking about anything that makes any sense to me. So.
Well, so then John goes on to say that in the Socratic tradition, there's no clean separation from you knowing the thing and you knowing yourself. Did I jump something? You look like,
yeah, you jumped a little bit, right? So in the middle of this back and forth where John interrupts Jordan like 3 times, you know, that's why I asked the question, right? Because John's going, maybe, well, and Jordan's going, you know, and they're both talking over each other. And he goes, I don't know either, okay? Like, throw me a bone, John, right? And then he's asking, you know, Vervaeke permission not to know something in this point, which I find fascinating. And then he says, this is a deep metaphor, stumbling uphill with transformative consciousness. Maybe that's the burden he's talking about, right? Towards what? Right. And I think this is Peterson trying to drag John back into the frame that he started with and is most interested in, right? In the previous exchange, you know, John tried to drag it back out of the religious, theological, we'll call it, frame. And I think that's the problem. And then, you know, John starts up with, let me try that. It's a great question. And then Peterson says, thank you. I spent a lot of time thinking it up, which is fascinating to me that he would say that. And then, you know, John does his nervous laughter thing again, right? And he says, so for me, this type of knowing we're talking about, and you know, my note is, whoa, this is a new type of knowing? It's like, what's he, I don't know what John's saying here, actually. I have no idea, right? This kind of transformational knowing, there is no clean separation from you knowing the thing and you knowing yourself. Right. So again, that gets back to this idea that in order to know something, you have to conform to it and it conforms to you, right? There's this co-creation, there's this reciprocation involved. There's this opponent processing, right, from John. Right. And then that's when Peterson asks about the insight experience, or is that the same?
Now he's saying insight, right? Insight.
Yes.
Yeah.
Insight is what I have in my notes.
Yeah. I mean, it sounded, when he first said it, I thought he was saying inside as opposed to outside, but he's talking about insight.
Well, that's your bias, Karen.
Yeah.
You were looking for that, weren't you?
Is there a clear separation in the insight experiences?
Right.
And John says, in the insight experiences, when you start to link them together, you can start to get flow experiences. And what happens is, but if you just go back to the insight, why did he make that leap to insight experiences from transformational knowing? Right. is a kind of knowing. And then Jordan is thinking about, wait a minute, there is a kind of knowing that just comes out of the air, right? These insights.
Right.
And I think that's part of what's interesting to him. And it made me think about some stuff I've been reading lately. Somehow I stumbled on Rudolf Steiner. I don't know if it was something that Paul had mentioned because of his wife's connection with Waldorf School or what, but apparently Rudolf Steiner had this idea that, you know, vision, we perceive things that we see, and hearing is perceiving sounds, and thinking is an organ just like the other sense organs, and that thinking perceives ideas, which would seem to go along with John's thing about the Platonic idea that ideas are something that exist outside of ourselves.
Right.
I mean, isn't that the Platonic idea? That there is another realm of ideas.
Right, right. Well, the forms, right, which are the perfect ideals of things.
Well,
and you have contact with them, and that's how you know beauty, for example. That's how how you know them.
Yes, but also that there is a realm, there's some sort of a realm where these ideas exist. And so thinking can build step by step by step by step, or thinking can somehow perceive an idea that's there full blown, which in one sense, maybe one of the reasons that Jordan thinks about that is because of what Jung said about you don't have ideas, ideas have you.
Yeah.
Right?
Right. Well, there's this again, we're up to that dichotomy of things inside versus things outside, to your point, right? And then there's this thread, and who's laying down the golden thread, right? It's all the same thing, in essence. He's very much talking about tracking the golden thread. Who laid down the golden thread, Jordan? Right? Right? And then,
well, later on, he's going to come to ask about, is this a satanic attack? Which indicates that Jordan is quite aware that there are two kinds of ideas that can have us.
Right.
Right.
Yeah,
which is it puzzles me a little bit how he can be so adamant about psychedelics without considering that there are two different kinds of personages that you can meet in there.
Exactly. Yeah, that was Paul was going over that in his slice up of the psychedelics. I think in the second video, he really hammered that home. Like, you guys aren't getting it. It's not a tool for untrammeled good, right? It's a tool, and what happens when you use the tool, who knows, right? So my argument's always more bad than good. Pretty reliable. Like, you just sort of look around. Like, we have this data. White papers have been done. Like, all the science, and contrary to popular belief, all the science has been done. It's pretty clear. I mean, don't do that stuff. It's wicked dangerous, and you're far more likely to have a bad experience than a good one. And the good ones don't last long enough. You can't integrate them. So, it's puzzling to me that Peterson isn't more cautious about that. And he very much sees this outside thing, and he's very much taking the attitude. And I think Paul, highlighted this beautifully, taking the attitude that that's some kind of doorway to the outer thing. It's like, you guys keep denying the outer thing and saying the church is nuts, and then you go and grab psychedelics. No, this is the key to the outer thing, not that church thing. It's like, now we're talking about the same thing again. Like, what kind of magic is this? Stop with the magic tricks. We're right back to talking about exactly the same thing. It's
interesting that you can see that so clearly.
Oh yeah, it's always been clear to me. I'm like, what? It's funny too, because when you ask the hippies that I used to live with, or whatever, they're oh no, this is totally different. It's like, is it totally different because you think you have control over it? And then they run away, literally run away. Like, I mean, like, physically distance themselves from you when you ask them that question, because that's exactly what it is. They think they have control of the drugs, and they don't have control of the church, and they want control over the thing and probably what's beyond the door, right? That's my guess. It's just narcissism. Really not that hard. Everybody wants to, make it complicated, but I don't think so.
Okay, so hold on to that idea, because I really want to nail this idea about how everybody wants control. Because when Jordan and John start talking about Jordan's concern about power being the fundamental driver of motivation,
they all wish, because then it's something they can attain, and that's not how it works. Yeah. Right. And it's interesting too, because transformation versus insight, what are we really talking about here? Right? Because so Jordan makes the transformation to insight move. It's like, oh, are you saying that there's a transformative realm and now you can peek at it? because it's not what he was saying before. So I don't know why he made that move. Like, why did he make the move to insight? That's a very strange thing to do. If you
well, and is he thinking that insight is a shortcut to transformation?
Or maybe it's
because you don't want to go through the actual transformation.
Or worse yet, you want to see the transformation and then decide, right? Like, oh, I have an insight that I could have a transformation, but maybe I want this one instead. Because I don't think that's how that works either, but maybe it is. I don't know, but I'm suspicious of the move because it just seems like, what's the purpose of the insight? Are you trying to avoid something, or are you trying to decide something? Because that's what it sounds like. You're trying to make a choice.
Well, I find it interesting that he's so insistent, I guess, upon the I guess would be the postmodernist. He doesn't know who to blame, but whoever it is who's to blame for saying that power is at the bottom of Western culture rather than this move towards
John doesn't want him to blame the postmoderns, but
yes,
I don't think he has the blame wrong. I think John just wants to save the postmoderns at all costs, which is a strange thing.
Well, but on the other hand, though, there is this thing about human beings. It's not at the bottom of Western culture. In some ways, Western culture was one of the best at overcoming the problem. But there is this problem that's at the base of all humankind, is that everybody wants power. Everybody wants to be in control. Every single person wants some aspect of control over others.
I would say,
rather than control over themselves.
Yeah, control is the better word. The thing we call power doesn't exist. I'm actually gonna do a video on that on my channel at some point. I'm gearing up. I've got most of it ready. I just got to get more examples. But yeah, I think what everyone's pointing to is control, right? We always want more control. Like, I don't think that's controversial at all. And they do. That is what we're playing with, right? This transformation is not something you necessarily have control over. Well, unless you use drugs, honest, right? It's like, no, I don't think so. Right. And then
control must have something to do with knowledge, because I mean, it all goes back to the garden, and Eve was tempted with the knowledge of good and evil. And that apparently gave her a thought that she would have more control over things if she had the knowledge of good and evil. So control and the knowledge of good and evil are tied up together somehow. We'll get to the bottom of that one of these days, Mark. Meanwhile, we were back on insight experiences, and he goes on to talk about Csikszentmihalyi and Tai Chi Chuan. And what do you know about all that? I'm not familiar with those things.
So John talks a lot about this in the meditation series, right? And so he talks more about flow. And there's two types of flow. There's this hot flow and this cold flow. And the cold flow is like slow moving, but feeling the same sort of exhilaration, if you will. Although that's a bad word, but it's the best one I can come up with on the fly, that you get from, say, playing a video game really fast, right? It's that same. So it'd be more like the flow you get by doing a puzzle, right? Or by reading a book slowly, as opposed to the flow you get by like driving your car too fast on the highway, which I would never do, by the way, even though I have a very fast BMW. Ignore what you've heard. Yeah, so they're very different types of experiences, and because John claims that because there's not a lot of physical, right, it's less burnout, right, and then Peterson says, I need some of that, right? I must be in a hot state of flow all the time, right? And then John says that participatory sense, right, and that's sort of back to his types of knowing. When he says participatory sense, I think he's talking about types of knowing there, right? And then they go into at one-ment.
Well, right? John says at one-ment.
Yes, Jordan says
atonement.
At one-ment, and they never bridge that gap, right? They indicate they're talking about the same thing, but are they? I don't know. Like, I think they kind of are, and they kind of aren't, right?
Well, if they were talking about the same thing, I don't think Jordan would have. I mean, it's almost like Jordan was either correcting him or illustrating his own perspective on it, because his perspective is atonement, right? And John says exactly, and then Jordan says that pulls original sin into it,
right?
Which I thought was kind of an interesting move. but then John says this very peculiar thing. He says, or the other way around, or original sin made use of at one-ment. Now, right. I have a hard time grappling with what he's saying there. I can't wrap my head around what he's trying to say there. Could you figure it out?
No, I mean,
how can original sin make use of at one-ment? Or is he saying the people that
I think he
came up with the idea of original sin?
Right. I think he's blaming the church there or something, right?
Made use, but then he would say made use of atonement, not made use of at one-ment, because isn't at one-ment more this idea of, oh, we're all going to become one with the universe? And
yes, well, it's the Platonic one, right? That's John's Neoplatonic, so it's the Platonic one.
Oh, the at one-ment he's talking about is the Platonic one, not the New Age. Because there's a New Age at one-ment.
That's based roughly on the same set of like New Age is not new. It's just a recapitulation of the Platonic ideas. Like, New Age. No, it's not new. It may be new formulation, maybe new words, but it's not new. I mean, it's Aristotle or Plato, guys. Everyone's talking from the same playbook, right? None of this stuff is new.
Isn't that kind of interesting? With all the talk about how we are evolving into this higher species, we're still looking back thousands of years ago to these guys that were so much smarter than we are.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's always...
I mean, I was reading the other day some stuff about Heraclitus, whose idea that everything comes from fire, and he has all these ideas that he's thinking about, and I'm thinking, oh my God, he's like a quantum physicist way back at the beginning of time.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
None of this stuff has changed. And that's the thing. They go back and forth about atonement and one-ment and whether or not it's wandering up the city on the hill, right? And
John says, or original sin made use of at one-ment, and Jordan says as the antidote.
Right.
As the stuff of the grail is atonement.
Right.
He puts antidote, stuff of the grail, city on the hill, and wandering up to the city on the hill, all in the same space.
Right.
And I'm, as hard as I tried to think my way through it, I understand antidote.
Uh-huh.
I don't understand how stuff of the grail.
Well, because you're searching for something, right? For that eternal life.
Oh, the search for at one-ment.
Yes.
Okay, but atonement is a completely different thing. I mean, atonement is an accomplished reality. It is done. It is finished. Atonement has happened in history. It's over. It's not something that you can attain. It's not something someone is trying to attain. It was something Christ already accomplished. So the only way I can see that it's connected with the Grail is that the old Arthurian legend that somehow the Grail was the cup, either the cup that Christ drank from in the garden, or the cup that was used to capture his blood at the cross, or something like that. I mean, and then the city on the hill, or wandering up to the city on the hill. And John goes, wait a minute, I've got too many books going through my head right now.
Right, he's trying to parse Pilgrim's Progress and the City of God, which is disgusting, and all this other stuff, right? And then he invokes cool flow, and Peterson says, teach me. And John's like, I'd love to. Like, you can tell he really genuinely would, right? It's sort of this brotherly love action in a moment, this caring, something you don't see much in normal conversations. So I can see people be taken aback by it, assuming they got this far, because apparently a lot of people bailed out before they got to see that lovely moment. And then they're talking about, they transition right into Piaget and radical Christian ideas, and I'm like, wait, what happened? Because they're moving very quickly through these ideas. I think they recognize when they can't get right, when they have agreement, but they can't get any further. They know they can't get any further.
Well, I mean, John had just said in these circling practices, you get shared flow. And that's when Jordan says, that's what we're getting with, my YouTube channel and my talk with Jonathan Pageau and this talk. And then he goes back to the talk with Jonathan. He says, look, it got 1.5 million views. What is going on?
Right.
I don't, on the one hand, you could think, oh, he's all puffed up about getting a lot of views, but I don't think that's what it is at all. He's just puzzled. Why are so many people fascinated in this problem that he and Jonathan are trying to solve together, right?
Exactly.
And he seems absolutely, truthfully, he's just completely conflated about the whole thing. He's so eager to find an answer to this. It seems like he's desperate almost.
Yeah, that's certainly true. But in the midst of all this too, he calls John his old Taoist friend on the border between chaos and order, right? And I'm just like, oh, what a lovely moment, right? And John seems to say yes, like, yeah, enthusiastically, right? So,
well, first he says you and your he says John says Jonathan is more radical Christian than he realizes, and Gordon says yes, and I think that might be true of you too.
Right.
And quite possibly it's also true of me. Hearing you and your logos, John. Right. Your logos, John. And then he keeps going back to John's name.
Oh, yeah, the whole name thing.
Yeah. Now, you said something. Are you the one who said something at one point that John had misunderstood or misquoted the meaning of his name?
Yeah, that's what I was told by somebody who actually knows Hebrew. Unlike me, who barely knows any English. So,
and what does it actually mean if it doesn't mean what did John say it meant? Gift from God, a gift from God.
Right. So I don't. It wasn't gift from God. It was something. Give me a second, and I'll find it. Yeah, it wasn't quite gift from God. But the interesting thing is Jordan agreed, right? Jordan's like, yeah, gift from God, right? That's what John means. But I think that's what Jonathan means.
Oh, okay.
Not what John means. So that is the fundamental difference, is that it depends on, whether or not you're using sort of the short form or the long form of the name or something. And so I found that interesting because I had never heard that before either. I don't, the only things I catch on that are on YouTube channels, right? I don't normally catch these things unless they're told to me by somebody who actually knows stuff. Unlike me, who, like I said, I'm not a scholar of any of those sorts of things, so I'm not familiar with the meanings. But apparently, it's closer to having mercy. So it's more towards bow down to an inferior. So I think, that's all I've got from my expert. So I think what he means is John's the guy who bows to the inferior person, which is an interesting note if it's true, because John's very deferential, right? He's very respectful, and that's sort of what they talk about here, is how respectful he is towards religious people, even though he's not religious himself, right? And I agree. He's certainly very respectful of that, and he doesn't know how to take compliments, per se. But he takes them seriously, right? Like he thinks religious compliments, in particular, are things to be taken very seriously, and yeah.
Well, John was also the one that, in many times in the book of John, he refers to himself as the one whom Jesus loved. And there's another place where John is referred to as the one who leaned against Christ at the Last Supper. So John at least saw himself as a close friend, maybe closer than the other friends. And John was the one to whom Jesus looked when he was on the cross, and he wanted to put his mother in the hands of someone who would watch after her. And John was the one that he spoke to and said, "Look after my mother." Okay. So there is something there. And I don't know if that's what Jordan is getting at when he keeps saying John, and then he keeps talking about his own name. This is the next section right here. They're coming on where Jordan says, "My middle name is Bernd."
Bernd, yeah.
It's Norwegian. I've never admitted that to anyone because I was an object of mockery in school, as we all were from our names.
He said it once before, actually, because I heard the story before. So
yeah.
He did mention it before on video somewhere.
This idea that his middle name is Bear, but then he says, "Who knows what's in a name? Jordan, Bernd, Peterson." And I have seen comments on his channel before where people make much of the name that his name is Jordan, Peter's son. Right? Peter's son. Jordan, right. Like the River Jordan, and Peter's son. And so he's all wrapped up in there somehow, that their names have some kind of meaning. I mean, you could imagine, I'm not saying this is what's going on, but you could imagine that he's got some sort of idea that the two of them are at the cusp of whatever this thing is that's happening right now. And that almost like they're chosen or something.
I'm not saying that, Karen. I'm glad you did.
Yeah.
And I don't have to.
I'm not saying it. I'm just saying, why does he keep going over and over and over this as though there's some deep meaning? It almost sounds like some sort of conspiracy theory, like our names have some sort of secret Kabbalah meaning or something.
Well, yeah, and then he goes into the fact that his icon carver friend carved him in the arms of a bear, and he didn't even know what significance that had until afterwards. And it's like, wait, what? Like, that's a little weird, right?
And what significance does it have that he's in the arms of the bear? I don't get other than the fact that his middle name is Bear, what significance would it have that this bear has him in its grip?
Yeah, that I don't know. But I mean, his whole invocation there was just, what a weird synchronicity, right? I'll know, because that's where he draws his.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas the larger implication for, we'll say, somebody a little bit closer to the church might be more on the chosen line of things. That was your word, not mine. I mean, disclaimer that to the end of time. Yeah, there's definitely something there, right? Because I mean, he had just said, like, you're my old Taoist friend. Like, that's interesting. That's really interesting. And again, in this instance, he's playing the scientist and he's making John the mystic, which is weird because actually John's weak point is mysticism and Jordan's strong point is mysticism in some sense. So it's a very strange, interaction for sure.
Well, John goes on to say, John was my favorite gospel, if that means anything. And Jordan says, yeah, that makes sense. In the beginning was the word.
Yes.
And John says, yeah, the logos. And Jordan says, that suits you. I mean, these are very strange things to say to each other, I think. Very strange.
They are strange. And it's interesting that John cops to having a favorite gospel, and that Peterson points out, that it begins with talking about the logos, which makes sense to call it intelligibility, right? It's like, well, that's weird, right? So Jordan's effectively invoking this ultimate reality pattern, right? And saying, look at all these patterns. Like, what are they disclosing to us in our names? What are they disclosing to us in our favorite gospel? What are they disclosing to us, right? I think that's really what he's doing. Is he's making that call out to that dare I say, higher pattern, right? And that seems to be what's going on.
And then Jordan says, what do you make of this comment that the Spirit of Christ is being manifest in you? That isn't something you just go up to someone on the street and say to them.
Right.
You take that seriously. How do you maintain yourself?
Right. And John interrupts there again to say he does take it seriously. Like, I mean, I'm going to interrupt you just to tell you how seriously I take it. Fair enough. Like, yeah, people make much about the interruptions of Jordan, but I bet if you counted them, the interruptions of John are not too far away in the middle of Jordan speaking. So, yeah, and it's sort of unbelievable in some sense, because all these people basically say that, right? Like it's his girlfriend, right? It's a bunch of people. So.
Well, and of course, I think John was just ready to start talking about that some more. He had a lot more to say about that. And Jordan jumps in with and when he did this, I saw John kind of like, what? We're shifting gears again. Jordan jumps in with, you know what my biggest takeaway was from my biblical series, The Meaning of Israel, we who wrestle with God. And well, yeah, and John jumps in and interrupts a little bit. And then Jordan says again, we who struggle with God, maybe that's the real Christian spirit. That's the real Jewish spirit. It's the wrestling spirit. Why is there that strange scene where he wrestles with the angel? But isn't that what we're doing all the time? Yes.
Right. Right. And then the partial winning, but getting hurt, right? And that they go back to the sparring and set it back up with dialogue. It's not just all the time with God. It's all the time with each other. It's all the time with nature. It's all the time. Like we're always in this struggle, right? And that seems to be what Jordan's trying to call out. And then he goes into this whole thing about, Plato, right? And yes, Plato is a wrestler, right? It means broad shoulders or something, right? And so they're in the gym more than they're in the academy, right? Or in the grove or whatever.
Well, but even before John says that, Jordan says, so that's the other metaphor for dialogue, not just the tracking and sparring.
Right.
And that's
the struggle.
Not just the tracking, but sparring. And that sums up men's relationships, tracking and sparring. Do you think that's true? That sums up men's relationships, tracking and sparring?
I do not. I think that's not a good summary. I think maybe it's a good summary of the primary relationship that we have, right? And then I would immediately argue that, so we get this whole thing on the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord server, right? Where we talk about this idea that the man goes out into chaos and just builds stuff. Like mostly random stuff, by the way. Like we're just nuts. Like we're just going out there. Oh, I can build this. I can build that. I can build that, right? And then the woman comes along, right? And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, wait, I need to build a home to protect this beautiful thing, right? The aspirational component. And then we build this house. Sorry, not home. We build a house. So we build the house, and then she comes in and makes it a home, right? And then we stop going out into chaos randomly, or quite so randomly, we'll say, and we come up with a plan, right? Because all of a sudden we need a plan because look what's going on here, right? Like, oh, we got to protect this thing, right? And yeah, so I don't think it sums us up because there's certainly that whole aspect of, protection and contribution and cooperation. But I don't think that happens by itself. I think it happens as a result of inspiration.
Well, the thing that I notice about men's relationships, and my husband and I have talked about this quite a bit, is that men tend to be side by side when they're doing things. Even if they're having a conversation, it's shoulder to shoulder having a conversation, and they're both looking off into space and talking to each other. Men very seldom sit down and talk to each other face to face.
Interesting.
Which is kind of interesting because women are always face to face. We're always looking into each other's eyes. We're always intuiting what the other person is thinking. There's all this connection between our, you've probably heard this illustration before that men's brains are more like little boxes and everything is self-contained in all its little boxes. Right. And if all the little boxes, if everything's going well, the car's running, the household is okay, there's no problems, the children are healthy, the wife is happy, all the little boxes are fine, it's all good. Nothing to worry about it. where a woman's brain is more like a pile of spaghetti. Everything's connected to everything else, just all interwoven. You know, John's word that he always uses, interpenetrating. Everything inside a woman's mind interpenetrates everything else. So when we're talking to each other, our brains are interpenetrating. Our two spaghetti brains are getting connected. And so I think it's a very different way that women communicate with women than that men communicate with men. Plus, men tend to want to communicate together while they're doing something.
Yes.
Right?
Yep. We're together in the chaos, trying to make order or build something or whatever, right? We're constantly trying to build something, or, you know, and maybe what we're building towards is the struggle, right? Like we'll struggle to build something which might be the dominance hierarchy. Like, who's actually better at this? So I used to do Kempo karate, and I was really good at sparring because I'm quick. Well, I used to be quick before I got deathly sick. So it was very fast. And so they put me with people 2 belts up for sparring, because basically, even though I only knew, you know, the basic moves, I could kick their ass because I was so fast that they just, you know, and it was good for them because, like, all the fancy moves in the world aren't gonna help you against somebody who's that much quicker than you are. And I just happened to be that guy, fortunately for me. Not that I didn't lose plenty of times, but you know, that was good, right? Because then I got to see, oh, tactics matter. Like, tactics matter more than speed, right? And so it was, you know, it was really good for both parties. But that's the thing, like, oh, we're building something together. What are we building? We're building knowledge base about your skills versus my skills, and I'm learning from you beat me, I learn a lot, right? I win, maybe I learn a little bit, but I learn less. Right. And so there's that whole, right, it's flipped upside down. Piaget always talks about the inversion. There's an inversion there for sure. Right. The guy who wins learns the least. Sorry, you actually want to lose quite a bit so that you can learn more.
That's so interesting. When I lived in Japan, one of my sort of cultural informants in Japan explained to me that, and they might have been wrong, so I'm putting this proviso out there, but what they said was that the Japanese mindset is to admire those that have conquered them in war and to look down on those that they have conquered in war. It's the same principle operating there. Those that have conquered you, you have something to learn from. You want to aspire to that, right? The ideal is the judge. It's that thing that Jordan Peterson always says, right? Right. And
that's where you have the thing to learn.
Yeah.
They're above you. And men aren't like, I have this whole thing on competition and cooperation on my channel, right? They don't work the way people think. And so competition is very much a way to determine whether or not you have something more to learn. Like, so when you're in a competition, you may be expressing, but you're also learning in the expression. And so men, even if they're wrestling or fighting or sparring or whatever, they're learning from one another, right? And then, you know, Peterson points this out in the Suits episode where they're verbally sparring. They're fighting to win verbally, right? And then John doesn't like that because he's anti-competition, I guess, apparently, which is something I didn't really pick up on before. And he says, oh, you can shift out of that, right? You can have this shared sense of victory such that it's a dance. But the thing is, Peterson didn't imply, you know, that it wasn't a dance. He said that there is this relationship, right? This dialogical relationship. And so I'm not sure if John picked up on that, like this dialogical relationship, there's a winner, there's, you know, people who aren't winning, right? That doesn't mean it's not a dance. Like dance, there's such a thing as a dance contest. Like, I don't, you know, why are you making the distinction? It seems like a silly distinction to make.
I don't say bothered me, but it made me think that that's a really fundamental difference in the way that John and Jordan look at the world, because John seems to look at the world almost a little bit of this utopian idea that we can survive without competition. Right. Exactly. That we want to have non-competition in schools, and we don't want to teach children to compete because that's going to hurt their little feelings and all of that. And Jordan is all about, we have to strengthen one another, and the only way we can do that is by competing, right?
We have to be in a dominance hierarchy, to know where we are, to know how to orient. Like, that's the biggest thing.
And there are many of them. Everybody can find some hierarchy in which they can achieve, but you have to find one, because that's how you grow.
Right, but that's the big deal with capitalism, right? Capitalism
Mhm.
actually allows more hierarchies, so capitalism good. Yeah, and that's the deep confusion, and the bottom line is cooperation doesn't exist without competition. That's actually the case I make in my video on my channel
Mhm.
on navigating patterns. Is that this pattern, these two patterns of competition and cooperation are the same pattern, right? And one relies on the other. Like you have to go through competition to get to cooperation. And the reason why, at least what I postulate in my video, is that scoring. I think competition is all about scoring, and you can't cooperate without scoring, because how do you know if the other person's holding up their end of the bargain? And scoring is not a straightforward thing, because if you're taking care of the kids and I'm hauling sand, I'm not sure which is more valuable. Like how do you, but there is a score. Like there is a sense. We talk this way, we act this way, we do these things. Those, and so that's why it's important to understand the difference between these things, like to have a scoring mechanism, a way to value them, a value mechanism. And what is value other than the creation of hierarchy? And if hierarchy is older than trees, which I think Peterson's right about, then who are we to say we can do without it? So yeah, I think John's
Well, I mean,
utopian vision is not.
that's the whole idea of the free market, is that there has to be a pricing mechanism. If there is no pricing mechanism, there's no way for the economy to function. The pricing mechanism is the score.
I would say, yeah, I would say the free market exists irrespective of the pricing mechanism. The advantage of the free market is that the king's gold and your gold are worth the same, right? And so in my conception, what happened is when you split the principality of the king or the government from the principality of the religion, so in other words, your king's no longer the religious head. When you do that, let's say you're Jesus and you say, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, right? Render to God's what's God's, because I think that's what happened there, right? Boom, there's this split. And it would, and you might say, well, that's kind of silly. But it's like, well, that was the argument. Like Rome's perfectly happy to let you worship however you want. It was the Jews that were upset about this mostly. They're like, wait a minute, we can't worship however we want because our king is the closest to God, right? Roughly speaking. And so like, we're just confused about this and we're upset. And that's why we're rebelling to some extent. And Rome didn't have no say over it, right? And so, you get quite upset about that. And then Jesus comes along and makes this move. But what emerges from that, in my opinion, is the concept of capitalism per se. So by splitting the two principalities, by creating the two principalities, by splitting the one principality apart officially, you create capitalism per se. And that now there's three principalities in the world. I told this to Paul, right? There's three principalities, and that's what they are, right? There's the principality, roughly speaking, of money, right? It's not capitalism per se, but it's the principality of money. And then the implementation of capitalism is this idea that your money and the king's money and everybody else's money are the same money. They have roughly the same value, so they're not so far off. Because in the old days, if you found gold on your property, it belonged to the feudal lord, guys. So we had the idea of money, we had the idea of value, but the values were different based on who had the stuff. The king could buy things with even if he let you keep the gold, the king could buy things with the gold that you could not buy. And capitalism does away with all that, right? It's egalitarianism in the realm of value ownership.
Well, but intellectual property is owned by the corporation that hires you, not by you.
Well, it can be. It depends on what you want to do with that. You
can
give it to the corporation, or you can tell them to get bent and keep it. And people do, and they do it all the time.
When you develop intellectual property that you don't want the corporation to have, you can quit the corporation and go someplace else and find somebody to fund you and start your own company.
Or you can develop it independently and leave. I actually know people who did this. They do it all. It actually happens more often than you think. It's really not that the corporation owns everything. And when the corporations try to sue, they usually lose. To be fair, the courts are pretty like, no, that's not your idea, corporation. And the courts sometimes split the baby, right? They'll sometimes take an arm or a leg off the baby and say, well, they get so much percentage, but you had the idea, you own it. And so in the US, people talk about that, and that certainly happens. But like, I know a guy who actually founded a company by developing his entire idea on his own, even though he was part of another company that was in the same business. And then he left and started his own thing. And they did sue the ever living crap out of him, and they lost. and they lost and they lost and they lost. And he was able to keep that company intact. So this actually happens all the time. It's actually more common for people to keep their ideas than for the corporation to take them.
Well, we got a little bit off track, and we got off track because I said that we need a pricing mechanism in order for the economy to survive, and you said no. But that's exactly what happened in the
free market. Yeah,
that's exactly what happened in the Soviet Union. Was when they took over the means of production, they ended up with pallets and pallets and pallets full of nails and no use for them, because they had decided that they needed to make a lot of nails. But without a pricing mechanism, there's no way to decide what is needed for people. Price is what determines what's needed.
The free market determines what's needed. And so what happens is, and actually somebody asked me this.
What is the free market if it isn't the pricing mechanism?
Well, no, because they had a black market. And that's how you know when your economic system is failing. How big is your black market?
Well, that's a pricing mechanism.
Right, but that's not the free market. But that's not the free market. That's my point. Their pricing mechanisms are independent of the free market. The fact of a free market makes the most efficient pricing mechanism, right? But that could also, like, you can reform the idea of capitalism by stating capitalism is the measure of free access to capital. So in other words, you could say that Christopher Columbus was high in the capitalism index because he had access to capital. And the way he had access to capital was by going to the king and queen who had all the money, basically. Mm-hmm. But he was high up in the capitalism measure, right? His measure of capitalism is very high because he had access. And actually, if you sort of think of things that way, a lot of things make more sense. And then you can say, well, why is an economy broken when it has a bigger black market? Because what happens is people have the same access to capital, but where they're willing to spend it is different. Like, they're not spending it with the controlled system. They're spending it in the uncontrolled system. And we always associate black market with badness, but actually it's just a measure of how restrictive your government is, roughly speaking, or how corrupt your government is.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you're in that kind of a system, you don't. So the pricing mechanism is a corrective to the market. Let's put it that way.
Yes, pricing mechanisms will always show you where the market is. Mm-hmm. That's certainly true.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So the free market doesn't give you the ability to value. It's just a more efficient way to value everything. And that's the thing. I mean, that's why.
Because of distributed cognition, which is John's great love.
It's exactly dead on. It's because of the distributed cognition, right? It's maximally efficient, which means, roughly speaking, which means it has the maximal number of people contributing, which means it's better, right? Because the cognition that's handling it is much larger. Yes.
But that's the part that John likes the idea of distributed cognition, but even distributed cognition has buried within it the concept of competition. So
yes.
And he doesn't. So going back to the beginning of the conversation when they were talking about Philia Sophia and Philia Nicaea, and John was trying to make the point, I think, that Philia Nicaea is the bad version. Yeah. The love of victory is bad. And Philia Sophia is the good thing. The love of wisdom is the good thing.
Peterson seemed to agree, by the way.
So I know.
On the same page on that.
I know.
was shocked. False dichotomy.
We talked about that on the first episode, I think, where we talked about that's a false dichotomy, because the love of victory is also a good thing, as long as doesn't get out of hand. Well, but they come back to this thing with the Philia Nicaea right now. And this is where it shows up that Jordan actually did agree with him that there's something fundamentally bad about Philia Nicaea, because, they just talked about the dance. John says, yeah, that you can shift off of the competitive thing over into this dance that draws you beyond yourself.
Right.
And Jordan says, so is that the battle with the adversary?
Mm-hmm.
And he's likening that to the Philia Nicaea, the battle with the adversary.
Right.
Another very serious question, obviously related to the book of Job.
Right. Right. And I think that's problematic right there. I mean, and it's interesting. So with Phileia and Ikea, you have to use Phileia and Ikea if you're making a truth claim. And then John doesn't like Phileia and Ikea. Oh, you don't want to make truth claims. Right. Well, then there's no argument.
Well,
Also true, but there's no truth either. Right. So you've taken the truth out of the world.
Back that up a little bit. You have to use Phileia and Ikea if you want to make a truth claim.
Yes, you have no choice.
Well, explain that.
Well, because Phileia and Ikea is all about the battle of ideas. It's all about victory in some sense. Like what's victory? I mean, victory in the sense of philosophy is what's more true. So you can't make a truth. You don't have to make a truth claim. True, you don't have to make a truth claim. But if you're making a truth claim, you have to be in Phileia and Ikea. You don't have a choice. It's not a dichotomy. They both interpenetrate and interrelate to one another, right? So if you're making
if John is opposed to this idea of everything just being the propositions, right? Is he opposed to the idea that there is an ultimate truth? Is that one of the big differences between these two guys? Because I think Jordan Peterson seems to think that there is an ultimate truth.
Yeah. I think John has to be, given his, like, this is why it's interesting when John talks to Piaget and Pastor Paul in particular, right? Because they poke these holes in his stuff, and then he's got to think about it more, and he does a lot of jiggling around of ideas to try and get back to where he wants to stay, which is in this Neoplatonic, I mean, he's roughly, I think what he's actually pointing at is something like objective material reality as the ground of truth. And I'm not John, I don't know, but that seems to be the direction he's going in, right? Whereas everybody else who's not of that mind will say, and again, your physicist friend pointed out quite nicely that that's not even a thing. Don't go there because you can't, right? Seems to point at no, there's something else, right? The Platonic realm is primal, right? The Platonic realm of forms is primal. Or whatever equivalent that is. And in Christianity, it's the realm of heaven or something. So yeah, I think that John's constantly dancing around that. I think you see that every time he talks to Piaget. I think you just see him dancing around that issue constantly, because he doesn't have an answer in that direction. When he talks to mystics, he dances around it, right? When he talks to the people who talk about magic, Young Sun Kim, who's actually, I believe, a student of his, right? Works with him in the lab. He dances around it rather deftly, but he dances around it.
Now, when you say he dances around it, you mean he's dancing around this idea that there is an objective truth?
No, he's dancing around the idea that there's that there's some universal concept of truth from above.
Okay.
I think he very much thinks there's an objective truth. He has to rely on that as a scientist. Like, you have no choice but to be stuck in the objective truth trap if you're a scientist. Mm-hmm. And that's because science isn't wrong, right? It's onto something. It just isn't complete and is not primal. And that's the other part, right? Because mm-hmm. John's gonna end up trying to claim, as all the scientists seem to, that the objective truth is primal and that the subjective stuff is subservient in some fashion, right? And that doesn't seem to be true. Like, I don't know how anybody's going there. The opposite seems to be true by all the sense making we can possibly do over thousands of years. Like, distributed cognition over thousands of years says that's why we have religions. They evolved from our distributed cognition over thousands of years. Why are you making these crazy arguments? Problem solved.
Well, here's where I'm going to again make a pitch for the Nima Arkani Hamed video on the fundamental morality of physics, or the morality of fundamental physics. I can never remember what the name of it is, but I'm going to make a pitch for that, and I'm going to put it in the show notes. And you and I are going to meet again on Thursday, and we're going to pick it up from this point, because they're just starting to talk about the battle with the adversary, which I think is a good place to pick it up next time. And I think it's at about minute 38, maybe something like that, 37, 38.
Yeah, I have fewer timestamps here because there's more summary available to me. All right, now we can really start to summarize some of the stuff they're saying instead of relying on their actual words. So it'll get easier from this point forward, I think. Although we'll probably go deeper and spin off more, but it'll get easier to summarize the conversation. So.
Well, today was great. I really enjoyed it, and look forward to talking to you again on Thursday. And
yes,
you have a great week. If you think of anything you want to add to our plan, or if you have any notes you want me to put on the video, just let me know.
Yeah, I'll send you over something. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Mark.
All right.
Bye-bye.